The summons came not as a letter, but as a cold command wrapped in politeness. Margaret Cole had not been called to the Earl of Hartmore's private study in 3 years. When the footman's knock fell upon the servants' hall that morning, a chill settled deep in her bones, and she knew something terrible was about to happen. She smoothed her grey wool dress and climbed the back staircase with her heart beating in her throat. The study door stood half open. The Earl was behind his desk, a glass of brandy already in his hand even though it was barely past breakfast. He did not ask her to sit. "Clara has taken ill," he said flatly. "A fever. She cannot leave her bed for at least a week." Meg's hands tightened at her sides. Lady Clara was her half-sister, the legitimate daughter of the Earl, and officially Meg's mistress. In the world's eyes, Meg was nothing more than her lady's maid. The truth was far more complicated. The Earl was her father too, though he had never once acknowledged her as anything but a servant, a debt he paid only by giving her a roof after her mother died. "I am sorry to hear it," Meg said carefully. The Earl's gaze sharpened. "Sorry will not save this house party. The Duke of Ashford arrives tonight. He's the most powerful reform voice in the House of Lords, and I need his support for my railway investments. He also happens to be unmarried." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Clara was meant to charm him at dinner. If she cannot appear, everything falls apart. People will talk. They will say she is weak, or worse, that my household is in chaos." Meg felt the walls closing in. "What would you have me do, my lord?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way he had not done since the day she arrived at this estate as a frightened 15-year-old. "You will take her place, just for tonight. You will wear her gown, sit at the table, and pretend to be Lady Clara Winfield. You have the same colouring, the same build. Your mother saw to it that you were educated far above your station. You can speak like a lady when you choose to." The words struck her like a physical blow. "Impossible. Someone will recognize." "No one here knows Clara well enough. The guests are from London, not the county, and you will stay quiet when you must. If you refuse, I will turn you out without a character. You will have nothing, no reference, no position, nowhere to go." Meg swallowed. She had no family, no protector, no money. The Earl had made certain of that. She was trapped in service, invisible, her only value tied to his whims. "One evening," she whispered. "Only one," nodded, already dismissing her. "Clara's maid will dress you. Do not disappoint me." By 7 o'clock, Meg stood in front of a long mirror in Lady Clara's chambers, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Silk the color of twilight draped her shoulders. Pearls lay cool against her collarbone. Her hair, usually pinned back severely, now fell in soft waves around her face. She looked every inch a noblewoman. The lie was so perfect it made her feel sick. She descended the grand staircase into the drawing room, where guests were gathering before dinner. Candles flickered in crystal chandeliers. Low laughter rippled through the crowd. The air smelled of roses and beeswax and quiet power. She kept her chin lifted, her gloved hands steady, forcing herself to move slowly, gracefully, as her mother had taught her in a different life. And then she saw him. The Duke of Ashford stood near the marble fireplace, taller than the men around him, with dark hair and a strong, quiet face. He was not laughing with the others. He was listening, his grey eyes attentive, as if he was truly seeing people rather than simply watching them. When his gaze drifted across the room and landed on her, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of interest, a stillness. Meg's breath caught. She could not afford to be interesting. At dinner she was seated far from him, but she felt his attention like a warm hand on the back of her neck. The conversation turned to factory reform, a topic that clearly divided the table. Some of the older lords sneered at the Duke's progressive ideas. Others flattered him, hoping to gain favor. Meg kept her head down until an elderly viscountess leaned toward her and asked, loudly enough for half the table to hear, "And what does Lady Clara think of these radical notions about worker safety? Surely a young lady has no opinion on such dreary matters." A trap, she had to answer. Too ignorant and they would suspect her. Too knowledgeable and she would draw dangerous attention. She chose her words with care. "I think, my lady, that a man who works 14 hours in a mill has far more right to an opinion on safety than any of us in this room. I would not presume to speak for him, but I would certainly listen," fell around her. The Duke set down his fork and looked at her with open, unhidden surprise. The Viscountess sniffed, but the Duke spoke before anyone else could. "Well said." His voice was low and warm. "If more people listened before they judged, we might actually make progress." Strange, painful thrill moved through Meg's chest. She had spoken as herself, not as Clara, and for one beautiful, terrifying moment she felt seen. When the dinner ended and the ladies withdrew, she slipped away to the terrace to steady her breathing. The night air was cool on her heated skin. She gripped the stone balustrade and tried to silence the screaming voice inside her head. This is not your life. This is not your place. You are only a maid in a borrowed gown. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned and there he was, the Duke, alone. The moonlight traced silver lines across his broad shoulders and his expression was unreadable. Forgive me, he said quietly. I did not mean to startle you. I only wanted to say that I have rarely heard a woman speak so honestly at one of these gatherings. It was refreshing. Meg's heart hammered. I fear I spoke too plainly, Your Grace. My father will not be pleased. Then your father and I disagree on many things. He stepped closer, and the air between them seemed to tighten. May I ask you something, Lady Clara? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Do you truly believe that listening can change things, or was that just a pretty sentiment for the dinner table? She looked up into his searching grey eyes and felt the weight of the entire deception pressing down on her. She was lying to a man who valued truth above all else, but she could not stop herself from answering honestly. I believe that most people just want to be heard, Your Grace, and if they are heard, they might trust enough to change. But trusting is the hardest part. Held her gaze for a long moment. Something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like pain. Then he inclined his head and stepped back. Good night, Lady Clara. I hope we will speak again. He walked away into the darkness, leaving her standing alone with the terrible knowledge that she was falling into a trap of her own making. And she had no way out. The next morning, Meg returned to her maid's duties before the sun rose. She helped the real Clara sip weak tea, dabbed her fevered forehead with a cool cloth, and listened to her half-sister murmur deliriously about horses and lost gloves. The physician said Clara needed at least another 5 days of complete rest. 5 days. The Earl cornered Meg in the corridor that afternoon. His face was drawn with panic and greed. The Duke asked specifically about Clara this morning. He wants to walk with her in the gardens before the political symposium at 4. You will be ready. My lord, I cannot keep doing this. It is wrong. What is wrong, he hissed, is a bastard girl forgetting her place and costing me the only chance I have to save this family from ruin. Do you think I want you in my daughter's clothes? I am drowning in debt, and Ashford is the only man powerful enough to pull me out. Now do as you are told. Debt. That word landed strangely. Meg had glimpsed ledgers in the Earl's office, numbers that did not add up, payments to a man named Croft that seemed to have no purpose. But she had no time to think. She was dressed again in Clara's finery and sent out into the gardens like a lamb to slaughter. The Duke was waiting beneath a sprawling oak tree, his hands clasped behind his back. He smiled when he saw her, and the warmth in that smile nearly undid her completely. I am glad you came, he said. I half feared you might avoid me after last night. I was perhaps too forward. You were honest, Meg replied. That is not something to apologize for. They walked along a gravel path bordered by lavender and late roses. He spoke of the factory reform bill he was trying to push through Parliament, the endless resistance from landowners who cared more about profit than human life. Meg listened, and something inside her cracked open. This man truly cared. He was not performing for votes or praise. He was fighting a war that cost him allies and sleep, and he did it anyway. You look sad, she said softly. Without thinking, he stopped walking. Do I? Yes, behind your eyes. When you talk about the children working in the mills, you carry it with you long after the conversation ends. The Duke stared at her. For a moment his careful composure slipped. She saw exhaustion there, and a deep, private grief he clearly never showed anyone. You see too much, Lady Clara, he murmured. That is a dangerous gift. If someone truly sees you, they might also see the things you are trying to hide. He turned away, his jaw tight. Have spent years building walls, and you seem to walk right through them without even trying. Meg's heart ached. She was deceiving him, and yet she was also the only person in this house who understood what it meant to wear a mask every single day. She was an imposter, yes, but she was also real with him in a way she had never been with anyone else. Perhaps we all have things we hide, Your Grace, she said quietly. Perhaps we are all waiting for someone brave enough to look past them. Turned back to her, and the air between them grew heavy with unspoken emotion. He lifted his hand as if to touch her cheek, then stopped himself and let it fall. You should be careful, he said, his voice rough. I am not a safe man to know. Before she could answer, a servant appeared on the path, bowing. Your Grace, Mr. Croft's messenger is here. He insists on speaking with you immediately. Duke's entire body went rigid. Color drained from his face. Without another word, he strode away toward the house, leaving Meg standing alone with 1,000 questions burning in her mind. That night, unable to sleep, she crept back to the terrace. She needed air, needed to think. Voices drifted from the library window, which stood slightly open. She recognized the Earl's oily tone and then the Duke's, low and furious. "I have paid you everything Croft demanded," the Duke was saying. "Your debts are cleared 3 times over. If he threatens my sister's marriage again, I will ruin him publicly, no matter the cost to myself." "Croft does not care about your threats," the Earl replied. "He knows you will keep paying because you cannot bear to see Lady Georgiana's life destroyed, and as long as I remain your intermediary, I can make sure the payments continue smoothly, but I need more time to manage my own affairs." A cold, hard silence. Then the Duke's voice, shattered with exhaustion. "How much more must I sacrifice before this ends?" Meg pressed her hand to her mouth and slipped away into the darkness. She did not understand everything she had heard, but one thing was clear. The Duke was not free. He was trapped in a silent war, and the Earl was using him. And she, in her borrowed gown and borrowed name, was somehow tangled in the middle of it all. 2 days passed. Clara's fever broke, but she was still far too weak to leave her room. The Earl continued to parade Meg in her place, and each time she stepped into the drawing room wearing Clara's identity, the weight of the lie grew heavier. The Duke sought her out constantly. They walked in the garden, talked in quiet corners of the library, and once, during a tedious musical performance, he leaned close and whispered a dry observation about the soprano that made Meg stifle a laugh behind her fan. The intimacy of that shared moment felt more dangerous than any stolen kiss. But something had changed in him since the messenger arrived. A shadow lingered behind his smiles. He watched her with an intensity that bordered on painful, as if he was trying to memorize her face before losing it. One evening, after a tense political debate over dinner, he pulled her aside into the conservatory. The glass walls reflected the dying sunset, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. "Lady Clara," he said, and the name cut through her like a blade. "I find myself in an impossible position. There are things I cannot tell you, obligations that bind me in ways I never anticipated, and yet when I am with you I forget all of them." Meg's throat tightened. "What kind of obligations?" "The kind that ruin lives if broken." He took her hand, and his fingers were cold. "I should not be speaking to you like this. It is unfair to you, but I cannot seem to stay away." She wanted to tell him the truth. Every fiber of her being screamed to confess that she was not Lady Clara, that she was a servant, an illegitimate daughter, a woman with no name and no future. But fear locked the words in her throat. If she told him now, he would despise her for the deception. And worse, he might think she had been part of the Earl's scheme all along. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you are not the only one bound by circumstances you did not choose." He looked at her with such raw, open longing that her chest ached. "Then you understand what it means to want something you cannot have." Before she could answer, the conservatory door opened. Lady Beatrice, a sharp-eyed widow with a talent for sniffing out scandal, stepped inside. Her gaze flicked between them with delighted suspicion. "Forgive the intrusion," she said sweetly. "I was simply looking for my shawl, but perhaps I should warn you both. There is rather a lot of talk about how much time the Duke spends with Lady Clara. Some are even speculating about an engagement." The Duke dropped Meg's hand as if burned. "There will be no engagement," he said, and his voice was harder than she had ever heard it. "My future is already decided." Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow and retreated, but her words lingered like smoke. Meg stood frozen, the Duke's rejection ringing in her ears. He would not look at her. "It is better if we keep our distance," he said flatly, "for your sake." "My sake or for yours?" He flinched but did not answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her alone among the roses and the fading light. Meg wrapped her arms around herself and let the silence swallow her. She had known this would end badly. She just had not expected it to hurt so much. That night she found a note slipped under the door of the maid's room she shared with another servant. The handwriting was cramped and urgent. "They know who you are. Be careful. A friend." Meg stared at the paper until the words blurred. Someone in this house knew she was not Clara, and if that person talked, the consequences would destroy not just her, but everyone connected to the deception. She crumpled the note and threw it into the fire, but the fear remained, cold and sharp as a blade against her throat. The next morning the Earl summoned her again. He looked haggard, his cravat crooked, his hands trembling slightly. "You will attend the ball tonight," he said. "It is the final event of the house party. The Duke is expected to make an important announcement, and Clara must be seen at his side. After tonight, I will release you from this masquerade." "Me," Meg laughed bitterly. "You have trapped me in a lie that could destroy my reputation and any chance I might have had at an honest life." "Your reputation?" the Earl sneered. "You have no reputation. You are a servant, the daughter of a disgraced governess. Be grateful I gave you a roof over your head at all." The words landed like stones. She had always known how he saw her, but hearing it spoken aloud stripped away every illusion. She was nothing to him, a tool, a piece on his chessboard. Something inside her shifted. She would not beg, she would not cower. She would survive this night, and then she would leave this house forever, even if she had to walk barefoot to the nearest village and start a new life with nothing. She dressed for the ball with cold, deliberate hands. The gown was deep emerald silk, more beautiful than anything she had ever worn. She looked like a queen, but inside, she felt like a soldier marching into a battle she had already lost. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and jewels. Music swelled from a string quartet in the corner. Meg moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling when required, speaking when spoken to. The Duke was across the room, surrounded by politicians, and he did not look at her once. Then the music stopped. The Duke stepped onto the raised dais where the musicians had been playing, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. "I have come to Ashworth Hall to discuss reform, but I find that honesty compels me to address another matter. There have been rumors about an engagement. I wish to set the record straight." Meg's heart stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their curiosity like a physical force. The Duke's grey eyes finally met hers. There was pain in them and something that looked like apology. "I am engaged," he said quietly, "to Miss Lydia Havisham of Norfolk. The arrangement has been private, but I will no longer hide it. I wish Lady Clara Winfield every happiness, but she is not and never was my intended." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Meg stood frozen, her face a mask of composure, while inside she shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had never been free, he had never been hers. And everyone in this room now pitied her, the woman they believed had been chasing a duke who belonged to someone else. She curtsied deeply, her movements mechanical. "I wish you and Miss Havisham every joy, your grace," she said, and her voice did not waver. Then she turned and walked out of the ballroom with her head held high. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back the sob building in her chest. Footsteps followed her. She did not need to look to know who it was. "Lady Clara," the Duke said behind her, and his voice was raw. "Please let me explain." "Is nothing to explain." She turned to face him, and the tears she had been fighting finally spilled over. "You used me to distract yourself from a situation you could not escape. I was convenient." "Understand perfectly. That is not, I am not Lady Clara," she said, and the words tore out of her before she could stop them. "My name is Margaret Cole, I am her lady's maid. The Earl forced me to impersonate her because he thought you might marry her and save him from his debts. Everything between us was a lie." The Duke went very still, the color drained from his face. "What? I am the Earl's illegitimate daughter," she continued, her voice shaking. "I have no title, no fortune, no name. I never should have spoken to you. I never should have let myself hope." She saw it then. The shock in his expression curdled into something harder. Betrayal, fury. The walls she had glimpsed behind his eyes slammed back into place. "You deceived me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you said, everything I felt, was real," she said desperately. "At least on my side it was real." "Real?" He laughed, and the sound was bitter and cold. "You lied about who you were from the first moment we met. How can anything between us be real?" He turned and walked away without looking back. Meg stood alone in the corridor, the music from the ballroom drifting toward her like a cruel mockery of everything she had lost. She had told the truth at last, and it had cost her everything. Meg did not sleep that night. She packed her meager belongings in the dark, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. The Duke's final words echoed in her mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. He hated her, he thought she was nothing but a liar, and she could not even defend herself because he was right. She had lied. At dawn, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find the Duke's valet, a quiet man named Foster, holding a folded note. "His Grace requests your presence in the East Study before you depart," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "I have nothing to say to him." He said, "It concerns your safety, miss, not your feelings." The words chilled her. She took the note and read it quickly. The Duke's handwriting was sharp and hurried. "Croft knows about you. He will use you to hurt me. Please come. This is not about us." Something cold settled in her stomach. She followed Foster through the quiet house to the East Study, a small book-lined room far from the main guest quarters. The Duke was standing by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. "The door," he said without turning. She did. "What does Croft want with me?" He turned then, and she was shocked by his appearance. He looked as though he had not slept in days. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and his usual composure was completely gone. "Croft is a blackmailer," he said quietly. 5 years ago, my younger sister Georgiana fell in love with a man who promised her marriage and then abandoned her. She was young and foolish, and she wrote him letters that would ruin her reputation if they ever became public. She is married now to a good man, a viscount, and she is finally happy. Croft obtained those letters. He has been bleeding me dry ever since to keep them hidden. Meg listened, her heart sinking lower with every word. What does the Earl have to do with this? The Earl is the intermediary. Croft funnels the payments through Hartmore's debts to make the transactions look legitimate. In exchange, the Earl gets his debts cleared and keeps his own financial ruin at bay. It is an ugly, tangled web, and I am trapped in the center of it. The engagement to Miss Havisham, Meg said slowly. That is part of it too. He nodded, his jaw tight. Lydia Havisham's father is a powerful man. If I marry her, the connection will give me enough political capital to protect Georgiana even if the letters come out. Lydia agreed to the engagement because she has her own reasons for wanting a marriage of convenience. We made a pact, a cold, practical arrangement. And I told myself it was enough. Meg stepped closer, her anger at him softening into something more complicated. Why are you telling me this? Croft has discovered your identity, the Duke said, and his voice cracked. He knows you are the Earl's illegitimate daughter. He knows you impersonated Clara, and he knows that I care about you. He intends to expose you, to ruin you publicly, unless I pay him an amount I cannot possibly raise. Meg felt the floor tilt beneath her. Care about me? After everything I did? He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his. His grip was fierce, almost desperate. I was angry because I felt like a fool. I have spent years hiding the truth from everyone, building walls no one could breach, and you walked through them without even trying. I thought it was all a performance, a trick, but I know now that it was not. I saw the real you from the beginning. That is why I could not stay away. Burned in her eyes. I thought you despised me because of my birth, because I am illegitimate and poor and— No. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I never cared about your station. I cared that I had finally found someone who saw me, truly saw me, and I was terrified you would be dragged into this nightmare with me. And now you have been. She leaned into his touch, her heart breaking and healing all at once. What do we do? He rested his forehead against hers. I do not know, but I am done hiding. I am done letting Croft control my life. I will find a way to protect you and my sister, even if it costs me everything. They spent the next 2 days planning in secret. Meg brought him the Earl's ledgers, which she had quietly borrowed from the study, and together they pored over the numbers. The Duke's face grew grimmer with every page. Croft has been extorting not just me, but 6 other families, he said. The man is a predator. If we can prove his crimes, we can threaten him with exposure and the law. He will expose your sister out of spite, if we move first. The Duke looked at her with a strange light in his eyes. Georgiana's husband already knows. I told him the truth last night. He was furious, but not at her. He loves her and he will stand by her. The blackmail only works if I am ashamed. I am done being ashamed. Meg stared at him. You told your brother-in-law? That must have been terrifying. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but afterward I felt free. For the first time in 5 years I felt free. He reached across the desk and took her hand. And I have you to thank for that. You showed me that honesty, even when it hurts, is the only way forward. She shook her head. I lied to you from the start. I'm not a good example. You lied because you had no choice. And the moment you had a choice, you told me the truth. That took more courage than anything I have ever done. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. You are the bravest woman I have ever met, Margaret Cole, and I am in love with you. Words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Meg could barely breathe. You love me? Hopelessly, desperately, against all reason and logic. He smiled, and the smile transformed his tired face into something beautiful. I tried to fight it. I told myself I could not have you, but I cannot fight it anymore. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and trembling and full of all the words she could not say. When they broke apart, he was breathing hard, and his grey eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you too, she whispered. I have loved you since the night on the terrace, when you looked at me like I was the only person in the room who mattered. Pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. For a long moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in each other, letting the world outside disappear. Then a knock came at the door. The Duke straightened, his expression hardening. That will be Foster with news. I sent him to find Croft. The valet entered, his face pale. Your Grace, Mr. Croft is here. He demands to speak with you immediately. He has Lady Georgiana's letters with him. Duke's hand tightened on Meg. Then let us end this. Was a thin, oily man with a smile that never reached his eyes. He stood in the center of the East study, holding a leather portfolio, while the Duke and Meg faced him together. Touching, Croft said, glancing between them. The Duke and the Maid, a love story for the scandal sheets. Give me the letters, the Duke said flatly. We'll pay you nothing more, Croft laughed. You have no leverage, Your Grace. If I release these letters, your sister's marriage is destroyed. Her reputation will be in tatters. You will lose everything. Meg stepped forward. You are wrong. Lady Georgiana's husband already knows. He stands by her. The letters have no power anymore. Croft's smile flickered. You are bluffing. We are not. The Duke's voice was steady. I told him the truth myself, and I have also gathered evidence of your extortion. Ledgers, witness statements, accounts from the other families you have bled dry. One word from me, and you will be arrested before sunset. Croft's composure cracked. You would not dare. The scandal would destroy your political career. I do not care about my career, the Duke said quietly. I care about the people I love, and I will protect them even if it costs me everything. Now give me the letters and leave this house. You will never threaten anyone again. For a long, tense moment no one moved. Then Croft's shoulders sagged. He tossed the portfolio onto the desk with a sneer. You are a fool, Ashford. Love makes men weak, makes men free, the Duke replied. Something you will never understand. Croft left without another word. The moment the door closed behind him, the Duke slumped against the desk, his whole body trembling with released tension. Meg rushed to his side. It is over, she said, her voice thick with relief. It is really over. Pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. I could not have done this without you. You gave me the strength to fight. You had the strength all along, she whispered. You just needed someone to remind you. Kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, each touch a promise. Stay with me, not as a servant, not as an impostor. Stay as yourself. Stay as the woman I love. She laughed through her tears. What will people say? A duke and a lady's maid? Let them talk. He smiled down at her, and the shadows that had haunted his eyes were finally gone. I have spent my whole life caring what people think. I am done. I just want you. Scandal, when it came, was brief. The Earl fled to the continent to escape his creditors, and Clara, once recovered, was taken in by a kind aunt in Bath. The Duke's broken engagement to Miss Havisham was handled quietly, with both parties expressing mutual relief. And the letters Croft had held for so long were burned in the east study fireplace while the Duke and his sister watched, their hands clasped together. 3 months later, in a small stone church in the Duke's home village, Alexander Ashford married Margaret Cole. The guest list was small, but the love in the room was vast. Georgiana stood as witness, her husband at her side, her eyes bright with happy tears. The villagers, who had long admired the Duke's reform work, welcomed Meg with open arms. Her past did not matter to them. Her heart did. On their wedding night, they walked through the gardens of Ashford Hall under sky full of stars. Meg wore a simple blue gown, no jewels, no pretense. She had never felt more beautiful. Are you happy? He asked, his arm wrapped around her waist. More than I ever thought possible, she said, but I still cannot quite believe this is real, that I am allowed to be this happy. He stopped walking and turned her to face him. The moonlight traced the lines of his face, and she saw in his eyes the same man she had seen that first night, the man behind the title, the man who only wanted to be truly known. You are the only person who ever saw me, he said softly. Not the Duke, not the reformer, not the political ally or the wealthy patron, just me, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. She reached up and touched his cheek. There is nothing to deserve. I love you because of who you are, not what you can give me. He kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of forever. The night wrapped around them, gentle and still, and somewhere in the distance, the church bells began to ring. A year later, Meg stood in a bustling mill town where the Duke had helped establish new safety regulations. The workers, many of whom had once been children laboring in dangerous conditions, now had shorter hours, better wages, and schools for their sons and daughters. They gathered around the Duke and his Duchess with gratitude shining in their eyes. An old woman, her hands gnarled from years of weaving, caught Meg's hand. They said he was just a rich man playing at kindness, she said, her voice rough with emotion. But he listened. He truly listened. And you, my lady, you made sure he never stopped. Meg squeezed the woman's hand. He would have done it anyway. He just needed someone to believe in him. Across the crowd, the Duke caught her eye and smiled. It was the same smile he had given her that first night on the terrace, full of quiet wonder. She smiled back, her heart so full it ached. She had started this journey as a maid in a borrowed gown, terrified and invisible. Now she stood beside the man she loved, a duchess in her own right, fighting for a better world. The lies were behind them. The truth had set them both free, and in the end, that was all that mattered.